And as Jim said, the theme is Blessed Dominic Barberi as a teacher of Passion Prayer. So Dominic was the first to come to this Northern Europe as a Passionist. And a little just quick run through his life, basic details. He was born 1792 in Viterbo. He joined the Passionists in 1814, taught philosophy and theology in Rome, gave missions and retreats, held various jobs, offices as well. And he came to England in 1842 when he was about 50 years old and only worked here for 7 years. So we have this notion of Dominic as being a key figure, but he was actually here for a very short time. Died in Reading on his way to Woodchester, which was a house that was not long founded in Gloucestershire, I think, and took ill in the train. And he's remembered for his role in Newman's life. As you know, the general public, if they know Dominic's name, that's what they think of. And this is the blue plaque. And if you live in this country, you know what a blue plaque is commemorating some person. This is the blue plaque in Reading. It's not very clear. I couldn't get a clearer picture. But it's on the site of the railway tavern where Dominic was taken when he was dying. And he died in that tavern. It was a kind of railway hotel, you know, because nobody would take him into their home because there was a fear of plague, some kind of infectious disease at the time. And you'll see even on the blue plaque, it says, Blessed Dominic Barberi, Italian Passionist priest who received Blessed John Henry Newman into the Catholic Church. So that's kind of the key thing in people's minds. And of course, when they think of Dominic and Newman, and this is the icon made recently for the St. Barnabas Society, it's in their office in Littlemore. When people think about Dominic and Newman, they love to make a contrast. So this learned man, Newman, and this simple, uneducated Passionist, Dominic Barberi. But I'm hoping that today we'll kind of reflect on the truth or not truth of that. And this was an article in a magazine called The Free Thinker, round about the time when Newman died. And he says, when Newman flung himself at the feet of Father Dominic the Passionist and was received into the communion of Rome, he showed his conversion was a matter of temperament. The Father was greatly his inferior. That's a lovely line for a Passionist, isn't it? The Father was greatly his inferior, but he represented the Catholic Church, and only within that church could Newman find rest for his soul. Now, we know there's more to Dominic than being greatly inferior to Newman. And this is Newman himself, and just quotation from 2 letters. So this the night before Dominic receives him into the church. He's expecting Dominic to arrive in Littlemore. Dominic doesn't know yet what's going to happen. And Newman wrote a whole pile of letters to all his friends, telling them what he was going to do. And in some of these, he talks a bit about Dominic. So he says, Father Dominic has had his thoughts turned to England from a youth in a distinct and remarkable way. He's had little, this is about Dominic's ministry, has had little or nothing to do with conversions, but goes on missions and retreats among his own people. And I love this wee bit here. He is a simple, quaint man, an Italian, but a very sharp, clever man too in his way. So Newman had met Dominic at this stage, and this is how he sums him up. And here's another letter to another friend. And he talks about Dominic, a poor boy who I believe kept sheep near Rome, which is true. And from his youth, his thoughts have been most singularly and distinctly turned to the conversion of England. And again, he's a shrewd, clever man, but as unaffected and simple as a child, and most singularly kind in his thoughts of religious persons in our communion. I wish all persons were as charitable as I know him to be. So Newman's assessment of Dominic is, he's a very clever man, but a very uncomplicated man at the same time. And later, when they were gathering information to maybe think about trying to get Dominic made a saint, Newman was asked to write a letter to the Cardinal in Rome who was in charge of these saintly causes. And this is his, now this is quoted in the Divine Office book, but the text you have in the Divine Office book is a translation from the Italian. So it's taken from what Paul VI quoted at the Beatification. This is Newman's actual words, and you'll see some of the wording is different. Certainly, Father Dominic of the Mother of God was a most striking missioner and preacher, and he had a great part in my own conversion and that of others. His very look had a holy aspect, which when his figure came in sight, my circle most singularly, insight in my circle most singularly affected me. And his remarkable bonhomie in the midst of his sanctity was in itself a real holy preaching. So these words like holy aspect, bonhomie, holy preaching, they get kind of, what would you call it, watered down in what you have in the breviary because it's a translation of a translation. But this is the actual wording that Newman wrote. Now that long discourse of Paul VI at the beatification, there's only an extract from it in the Divine Office, but here's another part from the words Paul VI said at the beatification. And this gives us the other dimension of Dominic. He says, Father Dominic is worthy of memory as a scholar and an author of great studies of theology and philosophy. He was a profound writer of mystic and ascetic books. His writings are always remarkable in order to illustrate with dignity the religious life of the early 19th century, and always prayerful ones which enrich the thought and experience of the history of spirituality. So Paul VI's assessment is a bit different from he was greatly Newman's inferior. Paul VI recognizes Dominic not just as a holy man, but also as a learned man. And I digress here just to mention what we're calling the Barberi Digitization project. And this is almost complete, the first stage of it. So in Rome for the past year since, I think we approved it in about September, October last year, and is being funded by the funds of the former St. Joseph's Province and the former St. Patrick's Province, now united as the one province. Now in Rome, that photograph, by the way, was just some of the shells of Dominic's writings in the general archives. Through the project, they've been kind of conserved differently from that, so they're now in proper boxes for conservation. But the project involves the digitization of approximately 39 folders with more than 45,000 pages. Now these are not letters, they're not things written about Dominic, these are Dominic's own writings. And there's over 45,000 pages just in Rome, which make up the Blessed Dominic papers kept in the archives in St. John and Paul's. And all these are being digitized. Now that means just photographing, for want of a better word, page by page. It's not editing them, it's not transcribing them. That's a later stage, but it means that all the original manuscripts are now available in digital form. 45,000 pages. And here are some of the topics covered in these pages: philosophy, theology, religious life, apologetics, pastoral ministry, prayer and spirituality, autobiographical writings. And when you say theology, I mean that includes moral theology, it includes what we might call today systematic theology, the philosophy too, all the different areas of philosophy, logic, metaphysics, and all of that. What's the problem with this, of course? Here is the problem. Can you read this? Because Dominic's handwriting, and this is, some of them are transcripts, but this is an original handwritten page. Dominic's writing is notoriously difficult to read. But the first stage is making those pages available. There'll be next steps. So this is something they've been doing with Newman in recent years, is the Newman Digital Collection. And they have been doing they now have a website where you can access all these, a lot of published materials, some digitized manuscripts as well. And the hope is that we'll move towards that with Dominic. Now as well, what's been done at the moment is Rome. There are other Dominic papers in the archives of the province. So in Douai, for example, where the archives that were formerly in Minster Acres are now kept, these are just examples which are relevant today. A treatise on prayer, in English it's a translation, transcription, which is instructions, it's subtitled Instructions to Teach the Holy Exercise of Meditation. There are sermons in Italian and English, there are retreat notes, there's the recollections of young missionaries, and those of you who were here in 2017 will remember I kind of gave an exposition on that text at the seminar here. The Workings of Divine Mercy, that's his autobiography leading up to his joining the Passionists. It was published in Italian. There is an English translation, a typescript in Douai, and that was done by Conrad Charles. who was a member of St. Joseph's Province, who worked in the General Archives. At Mount Argus, I just discovered in the past year, there is a translation and transcription of what they call in English the Soul Guided to Perfection. This is the Divina Paraninfa in Italian. What's a paraninfa? Well, in English, it's a paranymph. What's a paranymph? It's the attendant of the bridegroom or the attendant of the bride. So it's about Jesus accompanying us in our life of prayer. Unusual title, but that's what it is. So those are here in the province, and they're inaccessible at the moment. So we want to include those also in the project. Maybe you didn't know that yet, but that'll come as a funding request in the next little while. Now, Blessed Dominic is a teacher of prayer. This portrait you maybe haven't seen before. It's in St. John and Paul's at the entrance to the retreat house, and I really like it. You know, it shows Dominic there with the book in front of him, open, scriptures, with the crucifix, and of course, Dominic, the Mother of God, the image of Mary. And we see Dominic portrayed as a person of prayer in this image. So what are we going to look at? Just 4 points here, which will be broken down. Dominic's own experience of Passion meditation, the Passionist Rule and tradition, different kinds of writing that he has, and then his teaching and practice. His own experience of meditation. Who is the chap with the beard? Well, he is a Passionist called Joseph Molayoni. Why is he dressed like that? Because later in life, he became a bishop in Bulgaria. But at the time we are interested in, he was a Passionist priest in Italy. Now, he was key in Dominic's own experience. Dominic, as you saw, was born in 1792, so his early years were lived in that period after the French Revolution. Napoleon leads the French army into Italy, takes over the Papal States, where Dominic was living. The religious orders are suppressed, all the monasteries are closed, people are sent away, and Joseph Molayoni, his family, lived near Dominic's family. So some of the Passionists came as refugees and lived with the Molayoni family, and that's how Dominic met them, because they were neighbors. He was looking for a priest who could help him, to kind of guide him, confession, spiritual guidance. So he went to Father Joachim first, who was very severe, and it didn't work out. And you would say that could have turned him off the Passionists forever. Fortunately, it didn't. So he then found Father Joseph. And Father Joseph was the right man for him. And this is what Urban Young says about this period in his life. It was not until he passed under Father Joseph's care that his spiritual life took definite shape and form in the Passionist mold. His soul was nourished and grew exceedingly with the newfound practice of mental prayer as explained by Father Joseph. Christ's passion and the sorrows of Mary became the favorite themes of his meditation and the absorbing objects of his love. This is Urban Young writing. So what we see there is Joseph, Passionist, taught him how to pray. He taught him meditation, he taught him interior prayer, as Gregory said this morning. And for Dominic, that was just something that changed his whole life. And this is in the Workings of the Divine Mercy, the autobiographical text. This is what Dominic himself writes about the experience when he first encountered passion meditation. He says, "On that occasion I received such an abundance of divine grace that I was completely overcome at the thought of God being so prodigal with the seed of his grace in such uncultivated soil." That's him. "From that moment, I remained so changed that I seemed to be someone else. How powerful a means is mental prayer for the changing of the heart." So this was his experience of beginning to pray in that interior way. Now, he knew prayers before that. He'd been saying prayers since his childhood, but this was opening up something new. And continue what Dominic says. "The first lights which seemed to give me a clearer knowledge of myself were these, that it would be almost impossible for me to save my soul while remaining in the world." We might not put it that way today. "And that it was equally impossible for anyone who thought of the passion of Jesus Christ to commit a deliberate sin. It was then I began to have a great desire to become a Passionist." So his desire to become a Passionist came through his discovery of prayer. Somebody teaching him how to pray to pray, teaching him how to meditate in the Passion, awakened that sense in him that here was something that was worth devoting your whole life to. So what can we say about Dominic's own experience of Passion meditation? Someone taught him what to do. That's Father Joseph. He tried to do this himself. In doing this, he was touched by God's grace, so he had a real inner experience. And that involved also an experience of conversion. And you see in the autobiography, and we're not going into this today, but in the text, you'll see the struggles that he goes through. Should I get married? Should I become a religious? I will if this happens, and if it doesn't happen, I won't. Making wagers with God. And he goes through all these things in the whole journey of conversion. And there are real struggles with, conflicting ambitions, conflicting desires. But through all this, his vocation becomes clear. And he sees where God is inviting him through that struggle. Now, what does he discover in the Passionists? Well, he discovers the Passionist Rule and tradition. And Gregor gave us an insight into that in the first session. So I just want to talk about the rule, Passionist Rule, St. Paul of the Cross, the rule on teaching prayer, way for novices, that's just 4 points, and then some early Passionist writings. At St. Paul of the Cross, we go to the diary. So 1720, he makes the retreat of 40 days in Castellazzo. He's 26 years old. What form did his prayer take? Well, he tells us. So at occasional points, not every day, occasional points in the diary, he writes about how he prays. And this is one of those days on the 26th of November. He describes what form his prayer took that day. I know that I also held colloquies, conversations, on the sorrowful passion of my beloved Jesus. When I speak to him of his sufferings, for example, I say, "Ah, my supreme good," and there's your phrase, Robin, from yesterday. "What were the sentiments of your sacred heart when you were scourged? My beloved spouse, how greatly did the sight of my grievous sins and gratitude afflict you? And my only love, why do I not die for you? Why am I not overwhelmed with sorrow?" And then I feel that sometimes my spirit can say no more, but remains thus in God, with his sufferings infused into the soul, and sometimes it seems as if my heart would break. I love that sentence, "What were the sentiments of your sacred heart when you were scourged?" Because he's saying to Jesus, how did you actually feel in that moment? So he's not looking at, how many pieces of metal or leather were on the scourge. There is an interest in that. But he's looking into the inner experience of Jesus in his passion, and he's trying himself to enter into that. I had an email just 3 or 4 days ago from a young man in the United States who was interested in the Passionists. And he wrote to the parish because he was looking to contact me. And what say in the email, what does St. Paul of the Cross mean when he says the sufferings of Jesus were infused in his soul? I haven't answered him yet. But it's language, it's how to express the inner experience. You try to put it into words, you're already distant from it. This is the problem with language describing these kind of experiences. But the rule is for the distance. And this is not the rule of 1775, which was the last rule before he died, the last version to be approved. This is the very first fragment. We've only 2 paragraphs from the rule of 1720. The rest was destroyed. Paul burned it because he didn't want people to be making something of him, which we're doing today. And he writes this, "O dearly beloved, he who really loves, whenever he brings Friday into mind, has reasons to die. To say Friday is to say the day when my God-made man suffered so much for me that he gave up his life by dying on the hard wood of the cross. And furthermore, dearly beloved, you must know that the main object in wearing black, according to the special inspiration God gave me, is to be clothed in mourning for the passion and death of Jesus. For this purpose, let us never forget to have always with us a constant and sorrowful remembrance of him. And so let each of the poor of Jesus," that's the Passionists we know today, "take care to instill in others meditation on the suffering of our Jesus." So there he's talking about connecting with the Passion. He's talking about this, loving and sorrowful remembrance. That kind of language comes from St. Francis de Sales' Treatise on the Love of God, which he was reading at the time. And then let us each take care to instill in others meditation on the suffering of Jesus. So in the very first text, before there were Passionists, he's already saying, let each of us, try to communicate this experience to others. Now, a simple way of doing that, as was taught to novices in the very early days of the Passionists, take a scene from the Passion, take a moment in the story of the Passion, and ask yourself 4 questions. Who suffers? What does he suffer? How does he suffer? Why does he suffer? And that's a basic, simple way of engaging in this meditation. Using your thought processes, using your imagination, your memory, your feelings to try and picture the thing and reflect on it. That's the beginning. As Gregor said, they're beginners and there are other ways later. Now, these early Passionists are also writing about this, so they're not just giving missions and retreats, they're also producing things like this. And this is probably the first book written by a Passionist on Passion meditation. This is a later edition. It's the 6th edition, as you can see, from 1797. There are earlier editions than that from the 1770s. And this was probably written by Father, you see the name at the top, Father John Mary of St. Ignatius. That's John Mary Choney, who was the 3rd superior general. He was a spiritual rector of St. Paul of the Cross in the second part of St. Paul's life. So that's an early example of writing, teaching people how to pray and teaching people how to meditate. The title is An Exercise of Brief and Affectionate Meditations on the Most Holy Passion of Jesus Christ for every day of the month. It was translated into English in the 1830s, or I think 1830s, by an Irish parish priest who had gone to Rome, and he brought back a copy of the book. He thought it was written by Vincent Stramby. In fact, it wasn't, but for many years people thought it was written by Vincent Stramby. And it was published in Dublin before the Passionists ever came to England or Ireland. And there was one copy here in Minstrakers, which is now in the archive in Dowie. However, I went there in July and I photographed every page with my phone because it's a very long way to go to Dowie from Dublin. So I have that on my phone now. Now, Dominic's different kinds of writing on the Passion. So in these 45,000 pages, there are different kinds of Passion writing in them. And just some examples. Oh, by the way, that thing of Dominic and all the books, that's a painting in Rome as well, in John and Paul's. So there are dialogues, meditations, motivum passionis, via passionis, how-to texts. He loves dialogues. So this is Our Lady talking to Teresa, or this is Jesus talking to the soul. If I can be honest, I find it quite tedious to read as a literary form. In 2023, I don't find that literary form very attractive. But there is a long tradition of dialogues going back to the fathers of the church, well, pre-Christian as well. Catherine of Siena had dialogues. There are other later people too. But it's a form he really likes, and you'd be surprised the number of times he uses it. Now, there are also meditations on the Passion, and some of these would have been written for publication, but some of them have been written also for use on the missions. So as you know, hands up anyone who gave an old-fashioned Passionist mission. I'm sure there are a few of us in the room. And the meditation was part of that. So you'd meditate aloud, as Gregor was quoting from the roll this morning. You'd actually give people an example of how to meditate. And we have a number of those written by Dominic. The motivum Pasionis, do you remember the motivum, Ephraim? Was part of the mission too. A little thought on the Passion. And in his time, it's seen as a kind of a moral dimension. So taking a moral lesson from a scene in the Passion, like, seeing the patience of Jesus, seeing the forgiveness of Jesus, that kind of thing. And that's how they interpret the motivum of the Passion. Then there's the Via Passionis. We'll come to that. We'll do a bit of depth in that. It's an original work of Dominic, and then some how-to texts. So Let's look at his teaching and practice. This painting of Dominic I really like. Dominic Barberi of the Mother of God, and above it it says, I have chosen you to announce the gospel, especially to England. And that is in a church in Reading. There's a church, I think it's Our Lady of Peace and Blessed Dominic is the name of the parish, and that image was commissioned for the church. It's in that church in Reading. So let's talk about Dominic's teaching and practice, instruction about how to pray, teaching on passion prayer, the Via Passionis, and then guidance for teachers of prayer. We're going to look at these. Now, instruction about how to pray. And here is, if you can read it there, it says, a treatise on prayer. And you'll see in the top, right up here, it says, St. Benedict's Priory. Now, when you read the text, Dominic begins by saying, I wrote some time ago a little book for the direction of religious entitled The Divine Paranymph, which I mentioned earlier. And this is the follow-up to it. So this is him following on, it's volume 2, part 2, Divine Paranymph. Does it exist in Italian? I don't know, because I haven't had time yet to go through the 45,000 pages. Maybe it's there. But this is a transcript and translation, which is now in Dowie, in the Passionist archives in Dowie, but was written by somebody in St. Benedict's Priory, which is what we know as Colwich Abbey. So Colwich Abbey, which in Dominic's time was somewhere else, and the nuns moved to there. It's just beside Aston Hall. It's in the next parish to Aston Hall, where Dominic made his first foundation in England. Those nuns have been closed down. What's the document called, sister, that closes down monasteries? I forget the name of it. Is it Cor something? Cor Unum? Yeah, it's not Cor Blimey, it should be. So there were only 5 of them, and they had to be dispersed, and they've all gone to Stanbrook. But fortunately, we have the book. Now, I'm going to give you some quotations from the book, just to give you a feeling for it. So, how to meditate? Dominic says, meditation is not a thing that in order to be learned requires many precepts and long lessons. So like St. Paul of the Cross, he's intent in telling people, this is easy. To encourage people, a little goodwill supplies for all. The less it is studied, and the more it's made with simplicity, from a sincere heart, sincerely desirous of its spiritual welfare, the better will it succeed. So the less you complicate it, the better it's going to be, he says. Keep it simple. Don't start, thinking too much about this. Just let it happen. Let God work. It does not even require much talent or cultivation of mind. So the most rude and ignorant, any volunteers? So the most rude and ignorant may apply themselves to it without study and without listening to many instructions. God himself becomes their master when they have a sincere will to please his divine majesty. So there you are. He's saying this is something accessible. This is something that anyone can do, and you don't have to have studied, you don't have to. Dominic himself could hardly read and write when he joined the Passionists. He was self-taught. He had hardly any schooling. And in the end, we have 45,000 pages. So God certainly was working in him. Now, how to meditate? God can and will very often of his own accord introduce himself into the soul by way of meditation without any preparation. And this is he's writing, this is the dialogue, so this is Our Lady talking to Teresa. As happened to you the other night, so Teresa's told her problems and her experiences, and Our Lady's replying. What happened the other night, when you'd scarcely placed yourself on your knees, then you felt almost out of yourself and engulfed in the vast sea of the Passion of Jesus. And I think it's very easy to see there a reflection of Dominic's own initial experience that he described a few slides ago. So he's putting into words what happened to him and saying, this can happen to you when you pray. So when you dispose yourself to meditate and feel that your heart has already moved to sentiments of affection, discontinue your meditation. Stop, Gregor said. Discontinue your meditation and pour out your heart in these sentiments as long as the emotion lasts. And when it's all past, you may continue the thread of meditation you'd proposed. So if something touches you, don't say, I have to get through all this, I better not delay here. Stop. Be just in the moment. Be with what is happening. Be with what God is doing in your life, what God is bringing into your heart. Just sit with that, and when the moment passes, pick up again where you left off. Try to keep your heart steady in the love of God. God knows how to compassionate you, to show compassion, provided you do not neglect any opportunity of knowing those things which are necessary for your state of life. He can communicate his grace in what time and manner he pleases. He can, when he pleases, raise a soul to the contemplation of heavenly things. So be faithful to this. Keep your heart steady. And a little reminder, your state in life, he's saying, it's not all about this bubble of prayer that you might want to lose yourself in. Your everyday life is going on too, and you have to keep that going, and don't be like the desert father, who became an angel, and so they said, we don't need to feed you anymore then because you're an angel. But let God raise you as and when he wishes. Now, Dominic's teaching on praying the Passion, this is a book that was published, I think, in 1877. So years after his death, the faithful soul guided by Jesus in meditation on his life and passion. Dialogues. Back to dialogues again. He loves that. So this is a book that leads you through the whole Passion. It's meditations in the form of a dialogue, reading you through the whole Passion story. So let's just get a taste of it. The crowning with thorns. Just a couple of examples here. And this is the soul reflecting, talking to Jesus about what they see in his Passion. I see your body reduced to a wound. I see you stripped from head to foot. I see you covered with blood and covered with the robe most ignominious to you. I see you, my heavenly King, crowned, but what crown is yours? Nothing but a crown of sharp thorns, sharp and cruel thorns. That was the crown I prepared for you, but you wanted to take the thorns so that you could crown me with roses. O love, O goodness of my God, how great you are. So this is the soul in the dialogue, looking at the Passion of Jesus and talking to Jesus about it. A bit like Paul of the Cross in the diary. When you were scourged, what were your sentiments of your Sacred Heart? It's this conversation with Jesus in prayer. Another little bit of the book, Father, forgive them. His heart burning only with the desire to be merciful to us, despite his pain, aloneness, and sorrow, Jesus, immediately on being raised between heaven and earth, offers a prayer befitting his immense kindness. He sees his cruel enemies at the foot of the cross, and he says, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. Jesus forgets everything but his boundless mercy. And then he says this lovely little sentence at the end. How could he speak anything but words of forgiveness? So Jesus is mercy itself, he says, and we shouldn't be surprised that the word he speaks on the cross is a word of forgiveness. And then finally, a little thought on, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. So in his journey through the Passion, he also takes the 7 words of Jesus on the cross. And this is Jesus talking in the dialogue about that word he speaks on the cross. And he says, it is true I did not really need to commend my spirit into the hands of my Father, but I wanted to do it to show my loving confidence in him. And to teach people to place their spirit in God in the same way, especially in time of tribulation. So he says, Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, not because he as Jesus needs to make an act of faith, but to show us how to cope with our own troubles, to show us that this, when we are in suffering, is a time to actually place our spirit in God. I want to look at this thing called the Via Passionis, the way of the Passion. And it's a text by Dominic. We have, there's a manuscript, there's a typescript, which somebody did also in Italian. There's no English version of it at the moment. But it was written by Dominic in 1839, so not long before he started his travels, initially to Belgium and then on to England. What is it? Well, he says himself, it's a series of 14 stations, which include the entire Passion story, beginning at the Last Supper, and ending with the taking down from the cross and burial, with related meditations, colloquies, etc. The whole series is based on events which we find in the Gospels. So it's like the Stations of the Cross, but it's all based on Scripture. So it doesn't include things in the Stations of the Cross that are not in the Bible. So the meeting with his mother on the way to Calvary, Veronica's veil, the three falls, all these stations are Scripture-based. Why did he write this? Well, this is what he says. Reflecting often on the purpose of my vocation to the Congregation of the Passion and the duty I assume to print on my heart and to impress in the hearts of others the grateful remembrance of the life-giving passion of Jesus, I have often feared that I have not fulfilled this obligation as I ought to have done. Thinking about the way of the cross, he thought it would be helpful, and this is his own words, be helpful to people if in fact the way of the cross were not limited only to considering Jesus condemned to death, etc., but were to embrace the whole series of events of his passion, beginning with the Last Supper and proceeding step by step to the descent from the cross and burial. In this way, not only literate people, but the lost, uneducated, would have a very easy way to understand and remember not only a part of the Passion, but the whole series of events of the Passion. And this devout practice could be called the Via Passionis, the way of the Passion. So he wants something that will help people, including people who can't read, to have a kind of a simple form of reflecting their way through the whole scriptural presentation of the Passion of Jesus. What's it for? Well, he says in his introduction 3 things. To illumine the mind, since the heart follows the guidance of the intellect, good old Thomist. To know our wounds and what will heal them. And to know how much God has loved us and how ungrateful we have been. So to provoke a response of love from us. And why now? And I like this. He says, the ignorance of the times in which we live is great, and the most fatal ignorance is ignorance of Jesus who has suffered for us. This is 1839. It's reassuring to know that we're not living in the old age where people think things like that. Now, let's look at the 14 stations that he did. This painting, I was looking for a couple of Passion paintings by a contemporary of St. Paul of the Cross, and I thought of Eugène Delacroix, painter in Paris in the 1800s, and this is his Agony in the Garden. Now, Delacroix was born a year before Ignatius Spencer and died a year before Ignatius Spencer. So he's really a contemporary of Dominic and what Dominic is writing. So let's just go through what the 14 stations are. Jesus celebrates the Last Supper with his disciples. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray and agonize. He goes to meet the soldiers. All of this is not in the stations as we know them. He's betrayed by Judas, bound as a vile wrongdoer. Jesus is brought to the tribunal of Caiaphas, where he's treated in a barbaric and inhuman way, led to trial before Pilate, brought to King Herod, who insults him and dresses him as a madman, led back to Pilate, and reckoned of less value than Barabbas, scourged at the pillar. All of these are not in the stations that, the 14 stations that we know, that we see in church. Jesus is crowned with thorns and shown to the people by Pilate, as he says, behold the man. Jesus is unjustly condemned to death and led to Calvary. Jesus reaches Calvary and is crucified. Jesus in agony on the cross. The last words and death of Jesus. Now in the station, those two are together. But Dominic takes Jesus' agony on the cross and then Jesus' death on the cross. And then the body of Jesus pierced by a lance, taken down from the cross and buried. And as you see, there's a real scriptural basis to all of this. Now, let's just take one of them and see what it looks like. So, in his writing of each of these stations on the way of the Passion, first the event is named. Then there are the customary vocal prayers that we say in church. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you. Have mercy on us, O Lord. And these prayers are followed by a consideration, which is a reflection, quite lengthy reflection that he writes on the particular moment, particular event. And after that, it's a colloquy, conversation. And these are prayerful words about this moment, spoken to Jesus or to the Father, or in the last station, spoken to Mary. So it then concludes with the thing we know so well, Holy Mother, pierce me through, that little prayer from the Stabat Mater. What can we say about these compared to the Stations of the Cross? So the same, but they're different. So they're the same because there are 14 of them. They include some vocal prayers. They're different because they have a biblical basis. They lead us through the whole Passion story from the Last Supper, and the texts that we have are written by Dominic. So let's take a taste of the text, just a couple of the stations, well, 3 of them. So this is the 3rd station, which is Jesus goes to meet the soldiers, betrayed by Judas and is bound. The fruit of the prayer of Jesus in Gethsemane should be the fruit of my prayer: courage, readiness to suffer everything for love of that God who suffered so much for me. Jesus in agony on the cross. We might not put it this way today. One of the 2 thieves goes from the cross to heaven and the other to hell. But then there's a little thought in that: to be crucified is not enough. We need to know how to profit from the cross as God sends us. So in suffering, it's all about attitude. That's what he's saying. And then this strikes me as a very beautiful phrase to express grief. Mary leaves her heart behind in the tomb of Jesus. This is Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's a very striking expression of the grief that Mary felt in that moment when her son dies. Mary leaves her heart behind in the tomb of Jesus. And what can we do ourselves? Well, in that 14th station, he says, enter into the heart of Jesus since the entrance is open. What do you see? You see graven on it the love Jesus has for you. You see how the divine lover wants to give you everything. So he's saying through this, enter into the mystery, connect with Jesus Christ, let your heart be touched. Don't just, go, as I said about one of our old men who used to do the stations every day in a great hurry. You see he's out there like an express train chugging from station to station. It has to be an inner experience. But Dominic's realistic too, and this is what he says at the end of the text. If these texts seem too long-winded, they can easily be shortened. Or in order not to bore the people too much, the Our Father, Hail Mary, and Glory Be can be left out. So he's saying, don't pile it on, be realistic. His own evaluation of the way of the Passion, the Via Passionis, it seems to me that this practice could work well for the glory of God and the great advantage of faithful souls, especially in these times when Jesus is little known in the world. So it's a way for people to connect with the reality of Jesus. Now, guidance for teachers of prayer. And again, this is an icon which is in a church in Caversham. Do you know Caversham? Which I think is near Reading as well. And it's in the parish there. And you see Dominic, and there's a little inscription here on the scroll he has. My heart, O Lord, will never rest until I behold that which I desire, which means coming to England. Thou hast begun the good work, and do thou vouchsafe to finish and perfect it. To God alone be honor and glory. So the inscription here talks about his missionary desire. But part of his mission, of course, is bringing people to a relationship with Jesus. So among these 45,000 pages, there are some things which are guidance for teachers of prayer. There's a directory of sacred eloquence. Now, these books on sacred eloquence were very popular, and there are different Passionist examples. It's about how to talk, but it's also about, how to create a sermon. But in the Passionist forms, they tell you how to write a meditation, how to do a passion motivum, and it's guidance for those who are going to be teaching people to pray. So this Italian directory he wrote in the 1830s. There's another book he wrote, there are 2 versions of it, Tools for Apostolic Ministry, subtitled Principles for the Study of Scripture, and the Fathers of the Church for those who want to be good workers in the Lord's vineyard. And then also, when he was living in Italy, a letter to a young missionary on the use of sacred scripture. So like St. Paul of the Cross and John Baptist and the early Passionists, Dominic is a man of the Bible. And we see that here. The Bible is the first source for his ministry, for his preaching, for his meditation. Now, a couple of books which are here in England, in Rome, but were written when he was here in England. And first, I mentioned earlier, the Recollections to Young Missionaries in England. The second is this Manual of Sacred Eloquence, written in England. And this is not the book he wrote in Italy, but one he wrote here. And it was written by him in English. Now, here it is. That's English. Can you make out a word here or there? I only came across this for the first time. I was in Rome last week or the week before. It's the first time I'd come across this. But it's mentioned in Skinner's book. So Gerard Skinner, who wrote this book about Blessed Dominic in 2021, he talks about the end of Dominic's life, and he's drawing on Alfred Wilson here. He says about the last part of Dominic's life, he was still starting work on his final works, a manual of sacred eloquence and recollections left to young missionaries in England during his last mission in Drury Lane in June, that's 21st of May to the 8th of June, 1849, completing the writings just 2 days before his death. So just 2 days before he died, he finishes this. And the latter work, the Recollections, is the last testament to young Passionists, advising them how to carry out their ministry. So what's Dominic doing 2 days before he dies? He's writing guidance for people about how to do ministry. So the Recollections is for Italian Passionists coming to England, and it's about the differences. That this might have worked in Italy, but it won't work in England. Do it that way. And then the Guide to Sacred Eloquence, Manual of Sacred Eloquence, which I haven't been able to read yet, that will be very interesting when we can get to decipher it. But you can see up to the very last moment of his life, he's intent on being a teacher of prayer, and he's intent on training teachers. Now, Patricia's going to do a thing on Thursday about training prayer guides. And you're in that tradition, that noble tradition of Dominic Barberi, on Thursday morning when you're going to be doing that with us. So if I'd prepared myself properly, at this point I would have had a conclusion. I don't have a conclusion. That picture, by the way, that's a sketch by Dickie Doyle, who was an illustrator for Punch. And it was made right on the back of a program, with a paper that he had at the opening of Southwark Cathedral. And Dominic was there with Ignatius. And Dickie Doyle sits in the cathedral, and the person who catches attention is Dominic Barberi. And he makes that sketch from life. So all these other paintings you saw are made by people who never saw him, who had no real idea what he looked like. This is made from life, and it's made the year before he died. Wow. So if you want to get close to him, this is the image. But by way of conclusion, I've pinched a conclusion from somebody else, and that is Cardinal Bourne, who gives this evaluation of Dominic, which I think is a way to conclude. He says, of all the preachers of the divine word who have worked for the salvation of souls in England, there is no one, in our opinion, to whom we are more indebted than the servant of God, Dominic of the Mother of God. Finished. Thank you.